There are places in the wilderness where silence feels older than time, where something watches, waits, and leaves no trace but fear. In this video, you'll hear 6 chilling accounts of hunters, hikers, and campers who survived eerie encounters with something massive, silent, and impossibly strange. From the shadowed forests of British Columbia to forgotten trails in the Apennines, these are stories that never made the official reports. Eli Carter had been hunting since he was 12, and at 56, with over 4 decades of experience in the forests of Washington, he thought he had seen everything. A quiet man with a broad frame and a face weathered by time and wilderness, Eli preferred hunting alone. For him, the solitude of the Pacific Northwest was a sacred place, where man and nature could meet in silence, without noise or judgment. On October 4th, 2021, he was on a trip to check his traps and track elk deep in a part of the forest he rarely ventured into. Steep ridges, thick underbrush, and very few trails. That remoteness was exactly what he liked. The third night brought cold rain and low fog, and with only the crackling of his fire to break the quiet, Eli felt more uneasy than usual. He had set out 3 traps earlier that day, along a ridge west of camp, and wanted to check them before dawn. With his 12-gauge Remington slung over his shoulder, a flashlight clipped to his vest, and a revolver holstered at his hip, he trudged into the wet dark. Thick branches creaked overhead. Damp ferns brushed against his boots. Something about the air felt wrong, heavy and charged. The first 2 traps were empty, but the third had its steel jaw twisted, bent backward, as if something impossibly strong had pried it open. He stared at it in disbelief. No black bear could do that, not like this. Then came the sound, a heavy thud, not far off, followed by the snap of a thick branch. Eli froze. The forest fell dead silent. His heart pounded. He raised the shotgun, scanning the trees. The light from his flashlight cut through the mist, revealing trunks, moss, and empty darkness. Then it moved. From the far edge of the beam, a shape began to rise, a silhouette darker than the forest itself. Broad shoulders, massive arms. It stepped forward, revealing a towering figure nearly 10 feet tall, covered in matted black hair. Its eyes reflected the light for a second. Yellow, wild, furious. Eli didn't think. He pulled the trigger. The blast tore through the silence, echoing through the hills. The creature recoiled, but didn't fall. It let out a deep, guttural scream that shook Eli's chest. It charged. Eli fired again. The second shot hit the beast square in the chest, but it only staggered. It kept coming, closing the gap with terrifying speed. He turned and ran, crashing through underbrush, slipping on moss and wet stone, heart hammering, legs burning. Behind him, branches snapped and heavy steps thundered in pursuit. He spun and fired a third shot. It struck the creature's shoulder, sending it reeling sideways into the trees. Its roar was raw and enraged, animal and yet somehow not. Eli didn't wait to see if it fell. He turned and ran harder, the forest blurring past, flashlight swinging wildly. He could hear it behind him, not running anymore but moving, tracking, circling. He reached a clearing near camp just as his legs nearly gave out. Blood dripped from a deep cut on his arm, likely from a tree limb. His ribs ached. He wasn't sure when he'd fallen. He turned in a wide arc, shotgun raised, sweat and rain mixing on his face. Silence. Then, another scream, this time farther off. Not quite retreating, but no longer right behind him. He waited there, shaking, until long after the sound stopped. Only then did he make it back to camp, latching the door of his canvas tent shut and loading every round he had left into the shotgun. His bruised shoulder ached from recoil. His mind raced. He didn't sleep that night. He kept the fire going until dawn, every muscle stiff with fear, shotgun across his lap, eyes fixed on the darkness outside. By morning, the fog had lifted. He returned to the site of the encounter with every step cautious and heart-pounding. The bent trap still lay twisted, but nearby he found more signs. Deep gouges carved high into the bark of 3 pine trees, each more than 9 feet above the ground. The scratches were wide, ragged, and terrifyingly deliberate. Claw marks, it seemed, but from something too large, too strong. No tracks, no blood, nothing else. 2 days later, rangers met him at the edge of the forest after he called in the incident. He didn't tell them everything, just that something large had attacked him. When they inspected the scene, they saw the marks in the trees and the mangled trap. They took photos, noted the damage, but quickly wrote it off. Likely a bear, they said. Maybe a mountain lion. They saw no prints, no signs of fur, no scat. They said without clearer evidence, it was just an animal attack, possibly even a freak accident. But Eli knew what he saw. He could still hear the roar, still feel the way the ground trembled under its charge, still picture the eyes, intelligent, furious, aware. His bruises and cuts faded over the weeks, but the terror didn't. In all his years in the woods, he had never felt fear like that. Some nights, when the wind howled through the trees, he would lie awake in his cabin, shotgun propped beside his bed, heart beating like it had that night. He avoided that part of the forest now, refusing to return no matter the season or the lure of the hunt. Something was there, something far stronger, faster, and more aware than anything he had ever known. The deep gouges on the tree bark, now faint with time, remained the only evidence, proof that something massive had been there, something that had charged a seasoned hunter and survived a point-blank blast of lead. Authorities closed the file as just another wilderness incident, but Eli carried the memory in his bones. Not just the fear, but the anger in the creature's eyes, the rage in its scream, and the knowledge that it hadn't truly fled. It had only let him go. Dr. Lucas Meinhardt was not a man of fear. At 41, the Austrian botanist had spent his life deep in the wild, climbing the Andes for moss samples, trekking through Arctic tundra for lichen studies, cataloging fragile alpine flora with obsessive precision. Quiet, meticulous, and introverted, Lucas found comfort in solitude and the natural order of things. That's why the remote peaks of the Siberian Sayan Mountains called to him. There, in a wilderness untouched by roads and cloaked in dense forest and ancient ice, rare plant species still grew undisturbed. He saw his solo expedition not as a risk, but as routine. He arrived on February 25th, 2019, when the snow was firm and daylight long enough for several hours of research. His plan was simple: hike north along the foothills, set up a base camp near a frozen creek, and collect alpine sedges and dwarf pines found only in high-elevation ravines. He left a location log and planned radio check-ins with a supply contact stationed a day's snowmobile ride south. The last radio call came on day 5. Lucas had sounded calm, even pleased. He reported good weather and promising samples, but after that, silence. The contact waited 3 days, then contacted the authorities. A week later, the rescue team found the camp empty and partially collapsed under fresh snow. They located Lucas 2 days later. He lay near a frozen creek, 30 minutes hike from his camp. Half submerged in the icy runoff, his torso was battered, ribs fractured, limbs twisted unnaturally beneath him. His coat had been pulled back, as if stripped, but not by the elements. His boots were gone. His socks, strangely, had been removed and left folded beside his head, almost placed there with care. No blood, no gashes, just deep bruising, chest, arms, hips, as though something massive had gripped and crushed him. The scene was quiet, no drag marks, no footprints in the surrounding snow. The only oddities beyond the body were the tall larch trees nearby, which bore long, vertical scratches that climbed 10 to 12 feet high. Deep grooves, not made by claws, but something harder, something gouging and deliberate. The search team marked the area and flew his body back to the city. The autopsy confirmed broken ribs, collapsed lungs, and organ trauma. No visible wounds. The official report: death by blunt force trauma, possibly from a bear. But some things didn't fit. The notebook found near him, soaked, partially frozen, was open to a page smudged by water. Most words were unreadable, but near the bottom, still legible in shaky handwriting, were the final lines Lucas ever wrote. Unseen eyes, watching, waiting. I don't know if they blink. His colleagues were baffled. Lucas was rational. He didn't entertain fantasy or paranoia, but those words, and the orderly socks, and the way his body had been left, something about it all was deeply wrong. What truly happened could only be pieced together from what little he left behind. He had likely gone out that morning to collect more samples. Temperatures had dropped, but the weather was clear. He would have followed the ridge trail along the creek, looking for the rare shrubs he'd described earlier in his notebook. Somewhere along that trail, he must have sensed something. There were no signs of a struggle, no claw marks on his coat, but his ribs had been broken as if something immense had squeezed the life from him. It wasn't a fall. There were no nearby ledges or slopes high enough, and the area around him hadn't been disturbed. No signs of an animal digging or scavenging, no bite marks, just those vertical gashes on the trees, spaced wide apart, each deep enough to tear bark down to the inner wood, and no tracks, not even his own, as if the snow had fallen again afterward, or as if something had moved through the forest without touching the ground. Back in the village near the Sion foothills, word of his death spread quickly. Locals remembered stories, old ones whispered in the winter about forest giants, shadowy things that moved between trees and watched those who lingered too long. They had always dismissed them as tales, but Lucas's last words chilled them. Several villagers later admitted they'd refused to help with the search, fearing what they might find. One old hunter claimed the scratches on the trees matched those he'd once seen during a blizzard in his youth, where no bear could climb and no man could reach. Another woman, a reindeer herder, said her grandfather used to speak of the tall ones, forest spirits with long arms and dead eyes who punished those who wandered off trail. The officials dismissed all of it. The final report made no mention of the notebook's last page. The folded socks were attributed to hypothermic confusion. The scratches were said to be from a bear, possibly marking territory. The case was closed. But among those who read the raw incident file, among fellow scientists and forest rangers, rumors began to spread. Not just of Lucas's injuries, but of the precise nature of the bruises, the pattern of the internal trauma, and the disturbing sense of placement at the scene. It was almost ritualistic, not wild or random, as if his death had meaning to whatever caused it. In the months after, others avoided the ridge where he was found. Even experienced trackers turned away, calling it cursed ground. No animals were seen there, no new growth. The frozen creek ran dark and quiet, and even birds seemed to avoid the air above it. Lucas Meinhardt was buried in Austria, far from the place that had taken him. His family never received full answers. Only his weather-stained notebook returned, sealed in plastic, the last page always drawing uneasy silence from those who dared read it. In the wilderness where he vanished, nothing has been seen since, but the trees still bear the marks. High, deliberate, terrifying. And anyone who walks too far into those woods comes back faster, quieter, eyes scanning the trees, not just for animals, but for something older, something unseen, that may still be watching. Dale McGregor had guided hunters through British Columbia's backcountry for over 3 decades. Broad-shouldered, quiet, and deeply familiar with every ridge, stream, and hidden meadow in the Caribou Mountains, he had a reputation for keeping clients safe and finding game even when others couldn't. On September 14, 2014, His newest client was Victor Allen, a 42-year-old investment broker from Calgary, fit but inexperienced, eager for his first bull elk. Dale had seen men like him before, restless, looking for meaning in the wild. They packed deep into the interior, farther than most would go, to a valley Dale trusted, filled with sign and usually untouched by other hunters. The first 3 days went well. They spotted tracks, heard distant bugles, and even glimpsed a large bull at twilight. But something began to gnaw at Dale. The forest around them seemed oddly still. No birds flitting through the trees, no squirrels chattering from branches. Even the insects, normally persistent in the fall damp, were absent. He didn't mention it to Victor, chalking it up to an early cold snap or timing. Still, it made the hairs on his neck rise. On the 4th morning, they followed a narrow game trail down a ridge, expecting to circle back toward a series of hidden meadows where elk often fed. But something pulled Dale off the trail, a faint path, barely visible, leading between old firs with bark worn smooth by weather. It wasn't a route he recognized, but it felt deliberate, like something had moved through there often enough to bend the forest in its path. They pushed through the thick timber for nearly 100 yards before stepping into the most unnatural sight Dale had ever seen. A clearing, perfectly round, about 30 feet across, flat as a lake in winter. No brush, no fallen limbs, just bare earth and snapped saplings marking the perimeter. Every one of those young trees had been broken at shoulder height, not cut, not gnawed, snapped cleanly, as if twisted by massive hands. In the center, a mound of bones, deer, elk, smaller mammals, all picked clean, gleaming white, with no signs of chewing, claw marks, or decay. Not a single leaf stirred, no birds above, no wind, just silence so deep it pressed against their ears. Dale stood frozen. 30 years in these mountains, and he had never seen ground like that. Victor stepped forward, but Dale held him back. Something was wrong. It wasn't just strange, it felt wrong in his bones, as if the land itself recoiled from that place. They backed out, moving slowly, not speaking. Dale marked the direction in his head, but never considered returning. That night, the unease worsened. Their camp was set beneath a stand of spruce a half-mile from the clearing. As dusk fell, a thick fog rolled in, muting the forest even further. Dale sharpened his knife by firelight, listening to the quiet, every crackle of the flames sounding too loud. Victor barely spoke, his eyes darting toward the shadows beyond the light. Then, just after midnight, it started. A footstep, not a snap or scurry. This was heavy, deliberate, placed with slow weight. Something walked around the edge of their camp, outside the ring of firelight. Dale reached for his rifle and froze, listening. Another step, then another, spaced seconds apart. It wasn't circling like a curious bear. It wasn't sniffing or rooting. It was pacing. The ground trembled faintly beneath one of the steps. Dale kept his eyes on the dark, heart pounding. He had faced wolves, cougars, and grizzlies, but this didn't sound like any of them. It didn't breathe loudly. It didn't make noise for the sake of it. It moved with the patience of something that didn't need to rush, something that already knew where they were. The pacing continued for nearly 10 minutes, then nothing. Not a branch snapped, not a footfall retreated. It was as if the thing had simply vanished into the trees. They didn't sleep. By dawn, Victor's face was pale, jaw clenched, hands trembling. Dale didn't question him when he said he wanted out. He felt the same. They packed in silence and hiked out, taking a longer route back to avoid the clearing. Even then, they moved fast, checking over their shoulders, the sound of their own boots suddenly louder than they'd ever remembered. Once they reached the nearest village 3 days later, Dale spoke with a local he trusted, an old trapper who'd lived in the area his whole life. When Dale mentioned the clearing, the man's face tightened. He said that patch of land had appeared less than a year ago. Locals had noticed it after a storm. No one saw it form. It had just been there. Nothing grew inside it, not even moss. Animals avoided it. Even birds refused to fly over. A few who'd entered it came back disoriented. One man said he felt watched the entire time, like the trees had eyes. Another refused to speak about it at all. Dale never filed a report, neither did Victor. They both agreed it wasn't something that could be explained. No predator, no weather event, no logical process could account for what they'd seen. Something had shaped that clearing, something powerful, something not concerned with being seen, the kind of force that didn't need to hide, only wait. Dale returned to guiding the following season, but never again in that part of the mountains. He rerouted all future trips around it, adding extra miles to stay far clear of the clearing. Victor never hunted again, and that strange silence still lingers around that land. The perfect ring, the snapped trees, the pile of spotless bones, untouched, unchanging. It's as if the forest itself has given that ground away to something else, something that listens, something that waits. Eli Navarro and Daniel Leung, both 24 and in the final year of their geology master's program, had traveled to British Columbia to explore an unmapped limestone cave system rumored to extend deep beneath the coastal ranges. Driven by the ambition to map uncharted passages and potentially publish groundbreaking findings, the two students carried high-end survey equipment, ropes, headlamps, and emergency supplies. Quiet and methodical, Eli was fascinated by karst formations and subterranean airflow. Daniel, more impulsive but equally skilled, specialized in mineral composition and cave acoustics. Their supervisor, Dr. Cardona, remained at base camp, accessible by radio. They descended through the known entrance on the third day of their expedition, June 29, 2022. The opening, shielded by dense spruce and nearly invisible without coordinates, led into a dry, horizontal shaft lined with pale stone and narrowing corridors. For the first 6 hours, everything went smoothly. They documented stalactite growth, mapped newly forming columns, and collected samples from sediment layers. But near twilight, nearly a mile into the system, the cave branched. At the fork, Eli paused. The air shifted, cooler, but still. Daniel pressed on toward the left shaft, drawn by a narrow passage where shadows thickened unnaturally. Minutes later, his voice crackled over the radio, shaken and low. He said he'd seen something, a figure, crouching near the tunnel wall. It hadn't moved at first, too large for a man, broader across the shoulders, arms long and motionless. It wore no gear. Its surface, whether skin or something else, seemed rough and dark, mottled with grime and shadows. The cave was silent except for Daniel's breathing. He thought it might be a lost hiker, but the shape remained still, low to the floor, like it had been watching them from the dark. Then it moved. Without a sound, it slipped backward into a narrow vertical fissure, one far too tight for a person of that size to enter. Yet it disappeared completely, swallowed by the rock like smoke. Eli caught up just in time to see the last flicker of shadow vanish into the crevice. They stood there, frozen, no noise, no dust, just the faint tick of water and the hum of their own headlamps. Then their lights began to flicker. At first, it was just Daniel's, dimming, then strobing once, twice. Then Eli's headlamp followed, the beam narrowing into a dull orange pulse before stabilizing again. Both checked their battery packs, fully charged, no moisture, no malfunction. Still, something inside them whispered to turn back. They didn't speak. They simply moved, as quickly and quietly as they could, back toward the main tunnel. When they reached the entrance 3 hours later, breathless and unnerved, they found their gear scattered. One of their packs, Daniel's, had been opened. Nothing was missing, but everything inside had been removed and laid out in a circle of pebbles a few feet from the cave mouth. Items were arranged with unsettling care, energy bars on one side, flashlight and compass opposite, their knife set in the center with its blade pointed outward. Around them, the ring of small white stones looked like it had been built one by one. No prints, no disturbance in the moss around the gear. It was as if someone, or something, had moved with perfect precision. They radioed Dr. Cardona. He responded immediately and ordered them not to re-enter. Rescue officials arrived the next morning. After a preliminary inspection, the narrow shaft where the figure had disappeared was deemed unstable. A geological team sealed it 2 days later with rock fill and concrete. The official report cited stress, fatigue, and visual confusion caused by low light and complex rock shadows. They called the rearranged gear a prank or misremembered packing. Eli and Daniel knew better. Both abandoned the idea of publishing their cave survey. They returned to campus in silence, changed. They continued their studies, but neither entered another cave. 3 weeks later, an ecologist named Mireille Gauthier was conducting a biodiversity assessment of the surrounding slopes. Experienced and sharp, she had hiked those ridges for years and was familiar with the venting cracks that peppered the terrain above the sealed system. Late one afternoon, while collecting moss samples near one of the larger vents, she heard something rise from below, deep, ragged breathing. It came in waves, slow and powerful, vibrating through the stone beneath her boots. Then came 3 knocks, evenly spaced, deliberate, echoing upward from within the sealed cave. Not falling rock, not echoes from animals or shifting earth. Rhythmic, intelligent. She backed away and left the mountain early, without finishing her collection. She never submitted her report and declined all future expeditions into the region. Since then, the cave entrance has remained closed. Local rangers patrol it now and then, but no new survey teams have been permitted inside. Rumors among forestry workers and nearby trappers have begun to circulate. They say the ground around that sealed shaft feels hollow, that the wind through the vents carries more than air. Some have claimed to hear faint clicking from beneath their feet, or feel tremors not tied to weather or tectonics. Nothing official has been stated beyond the original geological report, but those who've been near the cave, who've stood over the cracks or camped too close, speak of an unsettling awareness, a sense of being beneath something vast and hidden. Eli and Daniel have refused all interviews. They returned to academia, taking research positions far from the field. Their field notes remain unpublished, their samples unexamined. Only fragments of their story remain, quiet retellings among cave divers and alpine surveyors who warn new students never to ignore the signs. Flickering lights, rearranged gear, circles of stone, rhythmic sounds from below, and the knowledge that something crouched in the dark and watched without moving, long before they ever saw it. Camp Pinewood had stood in the remote folds of the Appalachian Mountains for more than 60 years, surrounded by unbroken forest, old logging trails, and steep, overgrown ravines that swallowed sunlight by afternoon. Nestled beside a winding creek, the camp had been built as a rustic summer retreat, just rows of weathered cabins, canvas tents, and a mess hall tucked between groves of pine and beech. For generations, children had come for swimming, hiking, crafts, and stories told around flickering fires. And for most, it was magical. But in the summer of 1998, during the 3rd session of the season, something happened that left scars in more than just memory. That year, attendance had been unusually high. 74 campers, aged 8 to 13, filled the grounds, watched over by counselors barely older than them, college students seeking summer work and a break from city noise. Among them were Claire, a junior studying biology, calm and responsible, and Jared, an outgoing music major with a talent for storytelling. The first week passed like so many before it. Sunburned shoulders, mosquito bites, muddy shoes, and the sound of kids laughing over ghost stories that always ended with exaggerated screams. But on the 5th night, July 21st, 1998, something changed. Around midnight, several children in the outermost cabins woke up crying. They said they'd heard something outside, heavy breathing, low growls, and sticks snapping under weight that sounded too deliberate to be wind or wildlife. One boy swore he saw a tall figure between the trees, crouched just beyond the edge of the light. It didn't move. It didn't speak. It just stood there, watching. The counselors checked the area with flashlights, brushing off the fear as a side effect of the horror stories told earlier that evening. There were no tracks, no damage, no animal eyes reflecting in the dark. Eventually, the kids calmed down, but by sunrise, everyone knew something had happened. 3 tents near the edge of camp had been disturbed. One had its zipper open from the outside, not torn or broken, but smoothly undone. The campers inside said they hadn't touched it. In another, the contents of their packs had been dumped out and arranged in a strange pattern across the dirt. Not scattered, but deliberately placed. Flashlights, socks, granola bars, canteens, lined up with unnatural care. The 3rd tent's sleeping bags had been turned inside out and zipped back up, like something had examined them, then folded them shut again. Near the fire pit, someone, or something, had arranged a spiral of small branches and pine needles, perfectly shaped, nearly 4 feet across. The sticks had been stripped of bark and pressed into the soil. Around it, the ground was smooth. No prints, no scuffs, just silence. 6 children were found with scratches on their arms. Long, shallow, irregular lines, almost like finger marks. None remembered how they'd gotten them. One boy had dirt packed beneath his fingernails and along the creases of his palms, like he'd been digging in his sleep. He said nothing, just stared out the window the rest of the day. Rangers were called in by afternoon. They walked the grounds, inspected the tents, examined the markings by the fire. There were no signs of bears, no coyote scat, no snapped branches or trails through the underbrush. They noted the scratches, the rearranged gear, and the stories from the campers. But by the time their report was filed, the conclusion was clear. Overactive imaginations, a few well-timed pranks, and a group of children too deep in the woods for their own comfort. That night, the mood shifted. The fire circle, usually full of songs and laughter, fell quiet early. Claire noticed several kids watching the trees instead of the flames. Jared tried to lift the mood with stories and jokes, but even he couldn't shake the tension. Some campers refused to leave their cabins to use the latrine. A few clutched flashlights while they slept. Just after 3 in the morning, a girl in cabin 4 woke her counselor in tears. She said something had whispered her name twice from just outside the wall. Another boy claimed he'd heard breathing beneath the floorboards, and one camper, pale and shaking, whispered that he'd seen a hand press against the window screen. A massive hand with 2 long fingers and skin like wet bark. The next morning, 7 campers were withdrawn early by their parents. By the end of the week, that number had more than doubled. Many refused to explain why they wanted to leave, but some told their parents they never wanted to go back into the woods again. One mother said her son had stopped sleeping entirely, waking in the night screaming about something crouched beside his bed. No further incidents were officially recorded, but small things continued. Birdsong around the camp became rare. Squirrels and chipmunks stopped appearing near the mess hall. The woods, once alive with sound, fell eerily quiet. Twice, counselors found stick arrangements near the creek, crude spirals, always fresh, always just outside the cleared paths. The director never acknowledged anything beyond minor camper anxiety. No formal statements were made. Staff were told not to discuss the disturbances, and by the next summer, the outer tent loop had been removed entirely. Trails were rerouted, new campfire locations chosen, and stories of that week faded into rumor. Years later, Jared admitted he still had drawings made by some of the kids during craft time after the incident. Most were typical: trees, deer, sunrises, but a few were unsettling. Dark shapes looming behind cabins, spirals etched in dirt, and tall, faceless figures with arms that reached the ground. One drawing showed a boy curled up in bed, while a shape squatted beside him, pressing one hand to the window. Camp Pinewood eventually closed its doors in the early 2000s, citing funding issues and maintenance problems. The cabins still stand, empty and falling into decay. The forest has nearly overtaken the fire pit. Trails are overgrown and signs have faded. But those who visit the site, hikers, surveyors, thrill seekers, sometimes report the same thing: the eerie silence, the feeling of being watched, and rarely the presence of strange stick patterns in the moss. No animals leave tracks there. Birds fly around the area. Even the air seems stiller, like something is holding its breath beneath the soil. And every now and then, someone claims to hear faint whispers at night, just beyond the tree line, calling names that don't belong to them, calling for someone to come closer. The couple had planned their camping trip as an escape from the noise of Rome. Luca, a structural engineer in his early 30s, craved silence after months of deadlines and traffic. His partner Sylvia, a quiet landscape photographer with a fondness for forgotten places, had read about a remote herder's trail in the Apennines, where ruins of old stone shelters still clung to moss-covered slopes. The trail, tucked deep into a forested pass near Abruzzo, hadn't appeared on newer maps. That made it perfect. They parked the car where the road thinned to gravel, shouldered their packs, and hiked in beneath heavy cloud cover. The trail was choked in places by wild laurel and chestnut saplings, but it was clearly man-made. Cut stone poking through the mud, collapsed cairns rising from undergrowth. Luca spotted rusted loops nailed into tree trunks, remnants of fencing long abandoned. The woods around them were hushed, but not unfriendly. Birds flickered in the canopy, and bees droned near tangled underbrush. It didn't feel haunted, not yet. By late afternoon on August 1st, 2024, they reached a level rise near the ruins of a stone enclosure. The wall had crumbled long ago, but part of the circular pen remained, blackened by weather. Sylvia decided to set up camp nearby. The place was calm, and the view down the slope caught the last light through the trees. They pitched their small dome tent beneath an alder, rolled out sleeping bags, and ate dinner cold, not wanting to bother with a fire. Night fell quickly. They slept dreamlessly until just before dawn, when the sound began. At first it was faint, soft chimes carried on still air, as if from distant goats. Delicate, irregular notes rang through the trees, not hurried, not windblown, slow, spaced, deliberate. Luca stirred first, thinking it was a herder, but there were no footsteps, no bleats, just the sound of bells growing gradually louder, as though something with weight moved through the forest at a measured pace. They unzipped the tent flap and peered into the gray morning. Fog lay heavy on the ground. Trees stood still. Nothing moved, but the sound stopped. The clearing was exactly as they'd left it, at least at first glance. Then Sylvia noticed the boots. The pair they'd left outside the tent were now side by side, laces neatly arranged, toes pointing away from camp. Their water bottles, left half full beside a log, had been set upright and aligned along a stick. A jacket Luca had draped over a branch was now folded carefully over a rock. Inside the fire pit, unused since their arrival, stood a carved stick figure. It was rough, bent arms and no face. Its legs had been driven deep into the ash, as if pressed there with force. The bark had been stripped, the limbs whittled at odd angles. It leaned slightly, like it had been watching. They packed and left without speaking. The bells didn't return as they hiked out, but the silence felt different, tighter. Nothing called, nothing stirred. It was as if the forest had paused to let something pass. Back in the village, at the base of the range, they stopped for coffee and mentioned what they'd heard. The woman at the counter stiffened. An older man seated nearby turned slowly toward them and asked where they'd camped. When Luca described the stone circle and the broken trail markers, the man only nodded and said the path had been closed decades ago. He told them about a shepherd who had gone missing in those woods sometime in the 1970s. The man had grazed goats along the trail his entire life, knew every bend and turn. One spring, he didn't return. His goats were found the next day in the clearing by the broken wall, all tied together with fresh rope, uninjured, but huddled in a tight circle, as if something had scared them into silence. The shepherd was never found. After that, the trail was left to rot. Some said the bells had returned every few years. Others claimed they'd heard scratching outside tents or found carved figures leaning against tree trunks. Luca asked if it was some local legend. The man just shrugged. They left that morning. Neither wanted to stay another night in the mountains. A few months later, a wildlife researcher from the nearby reserve, Dr. Mirella Costa, was working in the same region. She'd heard the story before, but dismissed it as local folklore. Her focus was on tracking nocturnal activity in the higher elevations. For 3 weeks, she worked alone, setting motion-sensitive cameras and recording calls. She noted shifts in behavior, deer paths gone cold, owl sightings dropping off, sudden disappearances of small mammals from certain sectors. Then one night, around 4:45 a.m., her audio recorder picked up the sound. 3 bell tones, soft, uneven, without pattern. The wind had been still that night. There was no livestock in the valley. Her campsite was miles from any pasture land. The chimes came again, closer this time. She woke to them, heart hammering, and remained still inside her bivy sack, clutching her flashlight but refusing to unzip the flap. The sounds continued for almost 7 minutes, then silence. When she emerged, nothing had been disturbed. But on a flat stone beside her cooking gear, she found 5 acorns arranged in a circle. Each had been carefully split open and cleaned. The interior shells glistened as if still wet. No animal she tracked had the dexterity or reason to do this. The cameras nearby captured no movement. She finished her research early and returned to her lab. In the report, she made no mention of the bells, but she later confided to a colleague that she no longer camped alone. Not at that forest, not anywhere near that trail. To this day, hikers occasionally wander near the old herder's path, drawn by the terrain or the ruins or the silence that clings to the stone. Few stay long, fewer stay overnight, and those who do sometimes return with stories, not of ghosts or wild beasts, but of something else. They speak of soft bells ringing in the pre-dawn dark, distant at first, then slowly drawing near, as if carried not by wind, but by deliberate movement through the trees. No footsteps accompany the sound, no figures are seen, just those eerie chimes, rising through silence, inching closer with every note.